So we're going to get started. And just to give you a few ideas for what to think about tonight, I'm going to review the agenda here in a minute, and we'll talk specifically about what we're really trying to get out of this. So the first part is going to be just a brief recap, walking you through, I'm sure, what some of you have already experienced online as you have managed the site and tried to explore on your own. That's always the best way to learn. But having been a part of this for over a year and a half now, I'm pretty familiar with the site and some of the capabilities. So if you have specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. But the functionality of the site itself is sort of secondary to our concerns. Our main concern tonight is how do we implement this to better student achievement. So that'll be the main focus. And to further that focus, we'll be using a challenge area that we thought would be coming up for even schools that started in early August. Reconstruction, I would think, would be coming up. I have a friend who teaches in Ohio, and they start fairly early in August, and that's still coming up. So we thought this could be an example for you so that you can learn how to implement this to supplement what you're already doing well. And the last piece is going to be, and it's the bulk of our time together, is going to be for questions at the end. Just a brief background so you know who you're listening to tonight. As you can see, I teach at Granville High School in Granville, Michigan. It's a southwest suburban high school, about 2,000 students in just outside of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I am an author and committee member of Insight. We began in February of 2015 and finished up this past summer. And I'm also a consultant for U.S. history and have served at the reading both as a reader and most recently as a table leader. So I know there's probably questions about as far as what does this program do for students on the exam, and we'll certainly be addressing that as well. Our key takeaways you can see, and I won't read these back to you, but really what we're trying to pull out of tonight's meeting is a way that you can see how to integrate this into your classroom tomorrow, next week. That this shouldn't be seen as something that's overwhelming. A bit of a misnomer that I've heard about Insight is it's prescriptive. It's not prescriptive. It's supposed to give you choices over the 10 most foundational and difficult parts of the course. All, of course, through research. We looked at over 10 years of test data. We looked at higher ed surveys, teacher surveys, and tried to narrow it down to what's most difficult to learn and what's most difficult to teach. So we'll be talking primarily about how to integrate more than anything else. And our focus question is, how do we use these materials? How do we make our selections as we go through Insight so that we can improve student achievement? So a brief recap, and what we'll be going through these next few slides are basically the definition of Insight, which I've sort of articulated already for you. These are the 10 most foundational and difficult. To give you an example of what that combination means, there were questions at first about why is synthesis not a part of this given the degree of difficulty, and it was not included because synthesis is not foundational. Understanding continuity and change is foundational. Understanding comparison is also foundational. And so these are foundational pieces and very difficult pieces. And what AP Insight seeks to do is build out instructional resources plus assessments for learning. And it's something that you will see emphasized in the program, and it's something to emphasize with your own students, that this is not an assessment of learning that would be more of a summative assessment. These are very targeted assessments that are also interventions in many ways, which we'll also be discussing. So again, the challenge areas I've already addressed, and you really think about 4 pillars of Insight: prepare, teach, assess, and act. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time tonight on prepare and act because, let's face it, we're teachers, we get in the year, and sometimes it turns into survival mode, especially if you have spent a month looking at this. And I'm sure in some ways it's this overwhelming labyrinth at the beginning of where do I start? How do I include this as a natural part of my scope and sequence for my course? And prepare can really unlock or unpack many of those answers to the questions that you have about how to do that. To give you an idea about the necessity of reading through the prepare, this is where the challenge area is unpacked. And I'll give you an example of one of the challenge areas is politics 1.0. It's the first learning objective in politics, and it really tries to assess students' understanding of continuity and changes to political parties. When you go through the prepare piece online, which I'll show you in a few minutes, this is where that's going to give you how we came about to define this particular challenge area. It's going to unpack some of the research, which I'll allude to in a few minutes, about what we found. Just to give you a brief example, with continuity and change, the research is pretty evident that students struggle much more with continuities than they do changes. It seems like to address changes is a natural inclination for many students, but continuity is something that's probably more difficult, and you can see that play out throughout the building block, both in the assessments as well as the performance tasks. So these are 4 pieces. So the prepare is really teacher driven. That's for you to explore it and glean a better understanding of the challenge area. Teaching is the natural part for you. That's where we go through performance tasks. They are designed to both test skills that students would see, for example, in the writing. I mentioned continuity and change, but there's also what is called in some ways a through course skill. So for the examples of political parties, we focused on students understanding continuities and changes, as well as writing theses by using secondary sources. In other words, what's the best way for students to learn how to write appropriate theses? It's to see how historians do it while they're tracing continuity and changes to a part of the course that's very difficult. The assessments are the building block quizzes and the challenge area assessments. Building block quizzes are through all the building block quizzes. Challenge area would be right at the end of the 4 building blocks. The other part that is crucial for students is how many times have you either given an assessment, or for sure a student has taken an assessment, they get it back, and maybe they struggled on something. And we know that students know what they don't know. Often, though, they struggle with, what do I do next? And that's where the ACT resources step in. These are supposed to be student-driven ACT resources. So for you, it's not extra work. It's just giving that student a direction, giving them a resource to go to that's going to explicitly address their misunderstanding. It may not be that they are not able to do it at that moment. They just maybe misunderstood the task at hand. And so the ACT resources are a chance for you to reflect on the data from the assessment and give the students a direction to go after that. So that's a 30,000-foot view of the 4 pillars. So this gives you a better linear layout of what this looks like. Preparing, again, is unpacking the challenge area. Again, that's for you to read through. The teaching part of it is primarily performance task based, where these are, think of these as lessons that are ready to go, and they're student driven. If the course itself, if the new APUSH course is to make or help students become apprentice historians, that's when the teaching happens, when you're guiding them for certain, but you're also putting the history in their hands. The quizzes that happen are during the building block, after you've taught all the material, and then of course the ACT resources come after they've taken the quiz. Are there any questions before we start? Each section I'm going to try and pause just for a minute. Please know we'll have about a half hour at the end of our time where you can ask me all the questions you want, but our next task is to actually look at a specific challenge area to get a better understanding for what this might look like. Okay. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, um, one challenge area to think about that's coming up, hopefully, in your scope and sequence is reconstruction. And as I mentioned earlier with politics and power, political parties, continuity and change, you can see here we're addressing a specific part of the course, the Reconstruction period, focusing on regional identities and trying to help students learn how to tie evidence to theses. And the way this challenge area is built out is through primary sources that range from text documents to data-driven documents to cartoons. So you can see where we're trying to give them an array of primary sources to teach them how to connect that back to their thesis. Certainly something they would do on any long essay, perhaps a short answer, and certainly a DBQ. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the prepare piece for you is crucial. It's one of those areas I think that it's easy to skip past because, again, we just want to get to the teaching part of this. But just to illuminate this for you, this took us 6 months to write. To write it, to edit these, to prepare them in a way that would unlock what the challenge area is really all about. And as I mentioned earlier, that's where you're going to see some of the research defined. I gave the example of continuity. It's just a tougher skill for students. In comparison, it's tougher for them to find similarities. Likewise with periodization, which has been covered on the test the last 2 years. It was tougher for students to find similarities after the turning point. And that's where you're going to see some of that research. Data is another great example. Students tend to just repeat data rather than finding trends. Historians are much more interested in finding the trends of historical data. And that's where you as a teacher can go to see what's in this challenge area. What are the goals of this challenge area? What are the key takeaways for myself and for students? And it will allow you to make a better decision as you think about, do I incorporate this and how do I incorporate it? I'm seeing questions in the chat box about I'm struggling to figure out how to integrate this. I've been using it for a month. I'm not sure where to begin. This is a great starting point for you. This is an example. Again, I'm not going to read through these. These are moments where you can return to this and read through these to really glean what's being addressed. You can see where it's about supporting claims. I think visually, when you log on to Insight, you'll also find this matrix of sorts where it will really lay out, and it's great because conceptually for you, it will allow you to envision your scope and sequence, where you can see along the top of it, it gives you by time period. Then it will go through by challenge area, and it allows you to see when building blocks are taking place. So for instance, building block 5 is a very busy period for Insight. And you might look at that and think, okay, do I use all of those? Well, that's a great question. Do you? One thing that you might think about coupling this with is your instructional planning report from your exam. As you reflect on the IPR, are there particular periods and or skills that students are struggling more with or you find difficult to teach? Making the two of those documents, your IPR plus the layout of Insight, is a great way to think about how to envision integrating this. So maybe you don't do all 10 challenge areas this year. Maybe that's too much. Maybe you select 5 or 6 that you know you really need to work on. And you're going to own those and you're going to get really good at them. Maybe you return to it next year and say, okay, do I use those same 6? Do I integrate more? But those are some of the choices that you can make through data-driven decisions of how are students performing versus what does Insight address. So for us, this is challenge area 3, and you can see we're in period 5, and we'll be looking at building block C. So again, as you log on to Insight, which many of you have already done, this is under the Prepare tab, right there, and you select whichever challenge area you're looking at, And this drop-down green button allows you to think about, okay, which challenge area am I going to look at, and which, you can see the 4 pillars are also there by tab. The interface itself, I hope you found, is pretty intuitive. Included in Prepare is further literature about what the challenge area entails, how it was defined, what historical thinking skills are going to be addressed in this challenge area. And this is also crucial. I'm using this myself with my students. I teach 4 sections, all sophomores. Whenever they're introduced to a challenge area, one of the things I talk to them about, and I'm very explicit in it, is why it's difficult to learn. One of the aspects of insight you might find is that the performance tasks are indeed challenging. And that can be frustrating for students who maybe haven't experienced challenges. But for them to know that this is just a difficult concept, and they tend to need constant reminders about this, right? Where it's okay if you're struggling with this, because this is a difficult foundational part of the course. And oh, by the way, if you have success here, that's going to lead to other successes. The goal of these challenge areas is that they have ripple effects to the course. That if you can get this, it's going to show up elsewhere. And so while you don't necessarily need to share everything with them, having a couple highlights can really invite trust on their end. And for us to see, why is it just a difficult concept to teach? We are not the only ones who struggle to teach these particular concepts. You'll notice as you look through the challenge areas, a couple of them focus on economic policies. Specifically, one of them focuses on government and economic policies and when do they intervene. Those are difficult concepts to teach. And so this will actually unpack how that's able, or how you can better understand that. Okay. And again, this is what I addressed earlier, which took us about 6 months to write. This is the guide to the challenge area, which really further unpacks this, which I've already addressed. What you'll also see included are success criteria, student struggles, and misunderstandings defined. So as your students are going through the performance task, this is what is a little bit hopefully different with Insight, is we're trying to make targeted decisions during instruction. If we wait until assessments to intervene, that's a little too late. And so what this does is it allows you to be able to cross-reference during a performance task, how do I know if my students are successful? And then what do I do if they're not successful? How do I close the gap? And again, that's before assessment, even a formative assessment. So we're intervening prior to their taking the assessment. And then the fun part, the part that is natural for all of us, the teaching part of it, which again is the performance task. You'll notice when you log on, there's 2 different editions. There's a teacher, which of course has all the answer, teacher version, as well as a student version. And again, as you think about performance tasks, these were designed to be 45 minutes in length, and you might find, well, some of these are more difficult. What if it takes them an hour to complete? Or what if I look at there's basically tend to be 3 different tasks per performance task. What if I only have time for 2 of those? Or one of the 3 I feel like I already do well, so I only need 2. That's okay. Again, this isn't prescriptive. It offers you tremendous amount of choice. And if you're being attentive and if you're being attentive to the challenge area, you're already ahead. And again, this highlights where you can find some of the closing the gap resources as well as rationale. Finally, there's the assessment piece where and again, all of this assumes that students not only are going through the performance task, but are also still reading, they're still gleaning the right information that they normally would. And you'll see that in many of the unpacking of the challenge areas. I know for sure the ones that I wrote and ones that I edited and worked on others, we often will say, look, this performance task is best situated after they've already learned this concept. So it might be, if you're looking at, one of them is on migration patterns in the 20th century. So there's a particular moment that we want you, or at least want you to think about when to use that performance task. If you're looking at the first Great Migration, we'll talk about what sort of things would a student need to know in advance of the performance task? Much of that can be defined, and it will help you decide when to assess better as well. The data is just tremendous on the platform itself. And one of the things that you'll be able to do, and I'm sure if you have played around online with this, is you can see it gives strands for classes as well as individual students. And that can be, let me back up just one second, I apologize. That can be of tremendous value. Of course, we don't share the individual scores with students, but I know for my own students, what I will show them is the entirety of the class performance. Or as I mentioned, I have 4 different sections of APUSH, so I'll return the next day and say, okay, we took this assessment, how did we do? Well, third hour did this well, fifth hour did this well. Why are they different here? Why did we struggle more in third hour? Or look, we can actually see a tremendous amount of correlation here with everyone seems to get this concept. And in fact, there was a recent quiz that they took where everyone seemed to do really well with the change aspect of a particular multiple choice question, but the continuity part was more difficult for them. And that's a moment for me to reflect too as an instructor is, okay, how did I how did I do instructing on continuity? So the data allows you really to make targeted decisions on what to do next. So the ACT resources, again, are meant to be student driven. You're to highlight what they knew, what they didn't know, but then really the student has next step guides. So after they take their quiz, if they get a question wrong, at the conclusion of the quiz, it's going to tell them, here's what you maybe misunderstood, and then here's a resource that you can use to address that misunderstanding. There's also ACT resources that are specifically designed for multiple choice questions. And after a student takes the quiz, if they get the particular question wrong, they can click on it, and what it's going to do is it's going to condense their focus. Oftentimes students on multiple choice, especially stimuli-based questions, they get distracted by the language that's not crucial to the question. And so an example of that would be if Madison's Federalist number 10 is one of the stimuli for a question. What an ACT resource will do is it will readdress that question, but it might take away some of the distractors that are built into the language of the excerpt. And so again, it further focuses a student to what's really important here. It could be you misunderstood it because of the reading element. And again, these are all student driven. That's the powerful piece of this. This isn't extra work for any of you. And again, as you can see, it's targeting specific misunderstandings, and it will be color-coded for them. And this gives you a great visual as well for how your students are performing. Did everyone get number 4 wrong? Did only a few students? That allows you to make some better decisions about your instruction as well. So again, as you think about the full cycle here, from preparing, unpacking each challenge area, to actually teaching it through the performance tasks, to giving them the quizzes, and then finally acting upon what happened in the quiz. That's an example of what insight can look like per challenge area in each building block. And remember, challenge areas, there are 10 of them, and each of them except one has 4 building blocks built within it, spread over the course, which again, if you go back to the matrix, which lays out by period and challenge area what's happening, that allows you a better visual of what this looks like. Okay, that was a lot, and I know we moved through that fast, but honestly, that was part of the agenda, was that we would move through this in a expedited fashion to allow more time for questions. So I'm going to put up a couple questions here for you, and let's think about maybe question number 1. What have you found to be most useful and why? Because that might unlock some of other possibilities that you can foresee. I'm seeing a few people typing, so we're going to wait for their responses. Again, feel free to chime in via your microphone as well. Okay, we can see Marianne talking about the ACT section, which are super beneficial. Again, especially if you have large sections, it's very difficult to meet with every single student and address their particular misunderstandings. That's what Insight is attempting to do for you, is to have that be student driven. Okay, as you can see Shannon talking about the assignments to focus on for questions that they missed. I'm glad to hear, Sherry, you're going to try to use this building block as your first example for Insight. I'm going to wait for a couple more responses. It seems that many of you have not used much of Insight thus far, so I appreciate your comments about it's not available to answer. So we'll move on to a couple of other questions here in a couple minutes. And Henrik, your point here is well taken, that what Insight is going to do is it's going to circle back to earlier concepts that we just don't have time often to do, or for students seem to be disparate even though they're really not. That Insight's very intentional about making those connections across time. Yeah. Marianne's addressing something that I didn't really cover all that much, which are real-world case studies, which you can see when you go to the Teach tab on Insight. You'll find that you can either move to the performance task building block, or you can look at real-world case studies. Real-world case studies are an excellent resource of differentiation. If you have a student who it's clear that they're understanding this, and maybe they're a bit of a high flyer for you in class, real-world case studies allows us to differentiate for students quite well. Okay, so because many of you haven't used this, part of question 2 isn't going to be as applicable, obviously. If you haven't used it, it's going to be difficult to unpack some of what you've discovered. Are there particular questions, before we move on to number 3 about the upcoming unit, are there particular questions that you can think of that you logged on to tonight to hear and maybe haven't been addressed yet that would really help you to move forward to better integrate this? And again, part of this platform's design tonight was under the assumption that you had a basic working knowledge of some of the mechanics of Insight. So hopefully we can focus our questions on integration versus the actual mechanics of the interface. Again, feel free to chime in via the microphone if you're so inclined. Okay, that's a great question, Shannon. If you are logged into your AP Insight page, I can walk you through this. Again, hopefully we can keep it to mostly integration, but this is pretty simple to address rather quickly. So I'm logging into my page right now so I can walk you through each step. So when you click on assessments from the first page, the home page of Insight, and it takes you to the assessment page, on the left-hand side you'll see four blue boxes by historical thinking skill, objective, or challenge area. I'm going to choose challenge area, and I can actually click on a box and filter it by specific challenge area or by theme. You'll notice that politics and power has 3 different challenge areas, and so within that you might say, okay, I'm just going to look at argumentation, causation, popular movements, and Insight will filter it for you. Okay, by classes, not topic. If you go to results under my classes, it should allow you just to click on one particular class, 1 hour. And if that's not happening, I would contact someone to see if that can be addressed. But that should be, you should be able to do that. You can also go to manage, results. Yeah, you can click on it by period. Okay, so I'm sorry, Shannon, that might be something you need to follow up with. Are there other questions with as far as integration? Yeah, when you go, and Sherry's right, when you go to register each hour under manage classes, it allows you to name each of them. So you should have your school listed, and after that it allows you to section them off so that, in an example, I have 4 different sections. I had 4 different codes generated because I managed or made 4 different classes. Someone can walk you through that if you contact the help part. But that is absolutely possible. I have each class laid out. Henrik, I think one that's dependent on your situation and where your students are at. But I do think the nice thing about Insight is it seeks to marry the content with the skills. So you'll actually be able to continue with the content and addressing particular skills that we know are difficult for students. So these should be hand in glove. I don't know that it's a time that you need to think about stopping and reviewing. You should be able to move forward pretty smoothly. And Marianne has a great question about the matrix. Yes, that can be identified online. If you go to strategies on the main page and you click on strategies and you actually scroll down, it's entitled Challenge Area Concept Map, and that will show you the entire matrix. There's also an alternative way if the concept map, or matrix as I call it, didn't work. There's a translation and roadmap. That's an alternative way to look at it. I've used the concept map because that conceptualizes it well for me. But again, on the home page, if you go to strategies, where you're at the top where you see strategies, challenge areas, and assessments and discussions, click on strategies and scroll down until you get to identify the challenge areas and click on challenge area concept map. Sherry, you have an excellent comment. It's overwhelming, and don't feel bad about that. As I said, as a excuse me, as a committee member and author, there are times that I was overwhelmed when I looked at how this was going to impact my scope and sequence. The mere fact that you have the inclination to step back and say, I need to spend more time prepping and unpacking each challenge area is a credit to you. That's exactly what's going to enable this um, to be easier to integrate into your classroom. Shannon, can you take your question a step further? Are you saying should this move through should we have a chronological approach, or could I address this thematically? And the College Board's stance on this is, again, that you could teach the course chronologically, you could teach it thematically. That's entirely up to you and what works well in your district, and depending on your state, if you have specific state requirements. But both are options. I would tell you personally, I move through it chronologically because that is easier for me to conceptualize, but that is by no means the only way to do that. I'm going to wait. I see a couple questions coming in. We're going to address those, and then we're going to try and move on to question 3 so we can really start to talk about, okay, how do we integrate this in the next unit? And perhaps if reconstruction doesn't appeal to you right now, that you maybe want to spend some more time on it, there are other alternatives as well. Okay, so you meant implementing the AP Insight building blocks. So that's going to be designed by challenge area. So if you go to the challenge areas, each challenge area, I'll give you an example of cause and effect, 20th century migration. That's going to be stretching you across multiple time periods. So the first one is the first Great Migration. Second is the second Great Migration, followed by post-war suburbanization, focusing really on the 40s and 50s into the early 60s. And then the last one is actually the rise of the Sun Belt. So again, depending on if you're addressing the course thematically or chronologically. Okay. So within each of those are each separate building blocks. So Marianne's got a great question about integrating more than one challenge area at a time. Depending on your level of comfort with the program, I think is the first answer to that. You have to be comfortable, as you know, in front of your students to be confident in what you're introducing to them. So that would be the first thing, I think, is to make sure you're comfortable with it. But also, I think it goes back to something that Sherry addressed, which is It's taking a step back, looking at your current course syllabi, your current scope and sequence, and seeing, given what I already do, and given that Insight is supposed to supplement, not replace everything I do, where would it make sense to supplement? For me, in the current unit we're on, I think I have 2 or 3 challenge areas included as a part of the unit. But that might not be comfortable. So maybe you pick one that you know, I'm confident in this. I know my students struggle with it, so this will be beneficial for me. Again, our key takeaway tonight was, how do we increase student achievement? The best place for you to maybe unpack that is to go back to your IPR, cross-reference it with what Insight is presenting to you that might help, and with what you feel comfortable with. That might help you make the best decision. So I hope I answered that, Marianne. So question 3, if you don't mind transitioning, is taking us to the upcoming unit. And perhaps, we've tried to recommend you could use Reconstruction as that next unit. Maybe you have a week or two to prepare for that. If not, I think going to the Insight homepage and looking through each challenge area and seeing where does it make most sense. Is it a Gilded Age challenge area that you think is most beneficial? Is it waiting and seeing, okay, I'm going to use ethnicity and assimilation? There's a lot of options for you. But as you think about integration in the next unit or the following unit, what topic do you think they're going to struggle the most with? And more than that, what tool are you going to focus on that Insight offers to address those misunderstandings? So let's maybe focus on the latter part, which is, what resource do you think you're going to go to glean a better understanding of what Insight's offering? So Marianne's addressing 2 things. One, and I'm so glad we spent some time on this, and it seems like the participants, you are all finding this valuable, to focus on the prepare section, which is crucial. But Marianne brings up another good point with student progress sheets. As you start a challenge area, the student progress sheet is going to alert the student to both what they understand and what maybe they don't understand ahead of all the building block performance tasks. It's also going to do things like, okay, here's the vernacular you need to be aware of. As students encounter ethnicity and assimilation, are they comfortable with the term agency? Have they used the term agency before? Those student progress sheets can alert them to some of the language that they may find challenging as they encounter the building blocks. All right, Sherry, I see your question, and I can tell you there is a challenge area that addresses both of those. Populism and periodization. Populism you would find under CCOT, economic reform movements. And Marianne is addressing periodizing foreign policy, and the number one time period by far that students struggle with foreign policy, which is really Washington's administration through Monroe's. And the data was very clear on that, that students really struggle with that particular time period. And so both Sherry and Marianne are bringing up two great examples of how Insight, again, seeks to take those really difficult concepts to both teach and learn and gives you resources. Yeah, and Levi, yeah, I agree. That can be a tough concept for students to see the differences between the awakenings, and that's an example of a difficult concept, seeking to cover those across time. Which again, as you look through these, I'll give you an example. We thought maybe students struggled perhaps with particular concepts when we were designing the 10 challenge areas and defining them based on the data. And the data was revealing that there are some topics that we thought were challenging, and it turns out they're not challenging. I'm not suggesting the Great Awakening is not. I'm saying as you look through these 10 challenge areas, these are going to be those moments that really say it's going to affirm it in some cases, and in some cases it's going to surprise you. I worked on political parties, and that's one thing that I was surprised to see students struggle with, where we think, hey, they should really get this, shouldn't it? It's such a part of even a history textbook that it should be pretty easy to understand, and it turns out it's not. And so sometimes even, Levi, you're on the right page with even identifying a very discrete idea here of connecting those two topics. So that's great to see. And actually, Levi, just to give you an idea of where to go, if you look at causation and antebellum reform, which is a building block A, in argumentation, causation, and popular movements, some of what you're addressing might be addressed in that particular challenge area. Sure. So it's not going to, excuse me, I'm sorry, it's not going to center entirely just on the Second Great Awakening. For instance, abolitionism is highlighted as a part of this challenge area, and it is under causation in popular movements, and it's building block A, causation and antebellum reform. But look, abolitionism is addressed as a big part of that building block, and students need to know that's deeply connected to the Second Great Awakening in many ways. So it could be a way for you to take a concept that they struggle with and focus on a particular part of that movement. We have one other thing to do tonight, and I was not a part of the slides, I apologize, but there is a survey here for everyone to take based on tonight's session. And I know we're limited in time with only an hour, but are there any remaining questions that you have? We started a few minutes late, so I want to be respectful both to your time of being done at 8, but also to the time of allowing you the full hour. And if you have additional questions, I'm happy to answer them for the next few minutes. Sherry, there will be. Um, and I would watch for announcements on that, but this is the first of the PLC sessions, and any feedback you can provide and ideas would be most appreciated. Michael, that's an excellent question, and it's one that hopefully you can address in the survey. And I know we'll all be talking about how tonight's session went as well, and that could be a topic that we return to. Any other questions? I just want to thank you for your time. I think this is a tremendous platform for students and teachers. And I hope you all can move forward with a better plan for integrating this into your classroom. And again, to really address what our students are misunderstanding, excuse me, so that it can lead to better student performance. Of course, thank you for all of your time. Shannon, this is being recorded, so you can refer back to this, yes. Okay, well, if there are no further questions, I thank you for your time tonight, and I wish you the best of luck throughout the year.